in those fora of which we are a member, such as the United Nations. But we also want to be active in those other institutions that we may be an observer of, we may be a partner or a supporter, such as the African Union. As the WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala recently delivered in her speech, she argued that multilateralism faces serious challenges and must be, and I quote her, it must be reimagined and fit for purpose to serve 21st century challenges. She argued, and I agree, that multilateral institutions need to evolve to respond to new realities and to reflect shifts in the global balance of economic and geopolitical power. And I think those points are really very relevant. As Australia's representative to the African Union, I have a specific professional interest, as I'm sure most of you do, in finding the most efficient way to understand how Africa's peak political institution works. So if we all had endless time, we could spend a lot of time getting to know the institution, but we're all busy. We want to know in the most efficient way possible, what makes this organization tick? How does it work? From my observation, and I've only been here a short time, but there are many commissions, there are many committees, directorates and specialist agencies. It can be quite overwhelming when you're a new player trying to navigate all these different parts of the organisation, including the range of technical bodies that are scattered around the African continent. There's quite a lot of them, and to understand their roles and who does what in those organisations is really important. So as with any other large multilateral institution, the AU can seem a little bit daunting to outsiders, but of course, we diplomats arrive in Addis Ababa to begin our postings, have to get up to speed very quickly on how things work. This is not always easy, so we very much welcome the work that Amani's done to help make our job a little bit more efficient. So this was really our motivation in commissioning this report. We wanted Amani Africa to undertake this mapping exercise and to convene this panel to talk about the results of their work and try and get it disseminated out into the AU-focused community. I think it'll be a really useful tool, and I very much welcome the work that you've done. So we know that the AU agenda is very ambitious and it's very vast. And while this year marks the AU's 20th birthday, it's still evolving as an institution, as many institutions do. They take many, many years to find their true focus and the best way of conducting their business. Evolution is a normal part of any institution. So some of the important administrative and structural reforms of recent years show that there's quite a lot of reform to do, and that will probably continue. And I guess it relates back to the words of the WTO Director General. The organisation has to be fit for purpose. And while the world changes, we expect multilateral institutions may also have a need to change to maintain relevance and to continue to be fit for purpose. So what Amani has mapped, from what I understand and what our panel is going to discuss today, is the AU decision-making processes and the actors, who the key players are at a given point in time. And I really hope you find it illuminating. I'm sure most of you have a lot more knowledge than I have of what makes the AU tick, but I'm hoping that you will still find this presentation illuminating. We believe that building understanding and deepening the knowledge of our knowledge of the AU's institutional architecture, the way its decisions are made and who the key actors are at each stage of the decision-making process increases our effectiveness as professionals by clarifying that which might otherwise remain opaque. This in turn increases the efficiency of our interactions with the AU. It helps us pinpoint where we need to go to engage. And I think that's really important. I just want to finish by saying as we all know, the last few years have been tumultuous around the world for all of us, but particularly for Africa, for the African continent. And things continue to be tough. Now is not the time to retreat from multilateralism, but it's a time to strengthen it. It's a time to capitalize on the opportunities multilateralism presents, as I said, to help solve global and regional challenges. And it's really useful to use multilateral engagement to overcome many of the challenges that we face in the world. We've had COVID-19, we've civil war, coups, insurgencies, drought, flood. All of these things have beset the African continent and many other countries beyond. And at each point in dealing with these issues, the AU has played a role in responding to these challenges. I think we could all agree that its report card is not perfect. It's a mixed picture of how successfully it has been able to tackle the challenges. But in my view, this is to be expected. And its imperfect efforts and results are surely far better than its absence as a player in tackling these challenges. So I commend the AU and its leadership for what is, in my view, tireless efforts to combat some of these challenges that have arisen over the last couple of years, and some of which will unfortunately continue. So I hope by listening to the panel today, we might better understand some of those imperfections and also the opportunities and strengths that exist in the AU and how we can better target our interactions with it. Remember what I said at the beginning, efficiency is really important. We're all busy. We want to do things in the most efficient and effective way possible. So a fragmented world like a fragmented Africa is poorly equipped to respond effectively to global problems. We see that the AU offers a unified vision of what Africa looks like, and that's all outlined in their Agenda 2063, as we know, and we certainly wish it every success with that vision. So I'm looking forward to learning more from our panelists so that we can all engage more meaningfully with the AU during this 20th year and for many years to come. So I hope you enjoy the presentations. I would like to urge you to participate in the discussions, and I look forward to some really rich commentary about the report, and hope everyone finds it useful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I would also like to welcome Ambassador Hope Tumukunde for joining us today. Thank you. And thank you for the remarks and really for touching upon some of the issues that we will be discussing in detail, particularly around efficiency, transparency, but also the importance of multilateralism, given the rising challenge that we have encountered at the global level as well. Maybe I would like to now give the floor to our first speaker, Ambassador Namira Negm, who's joining us virtually on Zoom. And just as a way of introducing Ambassador Negm, she was the first women legal counsel in the African Union. And prior to that, she has also worked as a legal advisor in the Egyptian mission in New York at the UN. And currently she is the director of the African Union Migration Observatory. And Ambassador, welcome. And if you can somehow really give us your rich insight as AU Legal Counsel in terms of the rule setting and governing AU decision-making processes and the degree to which this rules and processes apply in practice in AU policy in decisions and lawmaking and agenda setting. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. I hope that my little insight will be useful to you. I would like to start by clarifying that the source of the decision-making in the AU is the Constitutive Act, when in Article 7, entitled Decisions of the Assembly, it states that the Assembly shall take its decisions by consensus, or failing which, by 2/3 majority of the member states of the African Union. However, procedural matters, including the question of whether a matter is one of procedure or not, shall be decided by a simple majority. Moreover, the modalities and categorization of decisions come from the rules of procedure of each house. Why am I saying that? Because the decision-making process and the preparations for it differ when we speak of the Assembly and the Executive Council on one hand, and the decision-making mechanisms of other organs on the other hand. The other organs include the Peace and Security Council, the Human Rights Committees, or the African Court. We have plenty, as the Ambassador of Australia just mentioned. However, for the sake of time and the main thesis of our gathering today, I will only focus on the decision-making on the level of the Assembly, which is more or less similar to the decision-making process at the Executive Council level, and the Peace and Security Council when I will address how an idea, then I will address how an idea become a treaty. Before delving into some comparisons, I think it's pertinent to shed light quickly on the rules of adopting decisions. I will start with the rules of procedures of the Assembly, which state in rules 26, 34, and 35, the details pertaining to adopting decisions. It's clarified in these rules that decisions of the Assembly are adopted upon recommendation by the Executive Council in writing, and that any member state may propose an amendment or withdraw a decision. It also clarifies the possibility of another member state to propose a withdrawn decision. Moreover, it obligates the Commission to provide the financial, legal, and structural implications of decisions if necessary. At this juncture, it's worth mentioning that the AU decisions are categorized in regulations, directives, and recommendations. Further, the non-implementation of regulations and directives should attract appropriate sanctions. As you all know, these aspects of the rules are yet to be honored. Now, I would like to emphasize on the main actors in the decision-making process. Member states, the different organs, mainly the AU Commission, other commissions like the African Committee on Human and People's Rights, or the African Court for Human and People's Rights, etc., sometimes RECs, especially in the peace and security field, are the actors engaged in the decision-making process in the AU. Of course, the engagement differ per organ, and their involvement differ per organ. Let me start with the easier one. The role of organs is clear in the founding documents, while they differ in their mandates. It's clear that in order to have the decisions adopted by the policy organs, they need to incorporate draft decisions in the reports to the ordinary sessions of the Executive Council. Hence, every organ, while reporting on its activities, propose a draft decision on its activities and the way forward. Here, the roles are clearly defined, where the organs submit their drafts directly to the policy organs without real interference from the AU Commission in their reports. Before it goes to the Executive Council, the PRC scrutinizes both the reports and the draft decisions and include any proposed amendments for the consideration of the Executive Council before adoption. The flaw in this process is the heavy involvement of politics in some technical matters and the repetition of all arguments on both the PRC and the Executive Council levels. Now, moving to the Peace and Security Council decisions, Article 4 of the AU Constitutive Act and the Peace and Security Protocol mandate member states to accept the implementation of AU and the Peace and Security Council decisions, particularly those relating to the promotion of peace and security on the continent and to contribute to the implementation of African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA. These include coordination and cooperation, consultation and partnership, etc., with RECs and REMs and continental security organizations. Article 16 of the Peace and Security Protocol also recognizes the contributions of RECs and REMs as part of the overall security architecture of the Union and suggests the harmonization and coordination of activities with these mechanisms to ensure effective partnership while taking account of the comparative advantage of each and the prevailing circumstances. These complementary systems are intended to ensure that the Peace and Security Council decisions are comprehensive, inclusive, consensual, and fully owned by member states, RECs, REMs, and CSOs. It is also meant to garner support by partners, including the UN, etc., for effective implementation in accordance with the principles of subsidiarity, complementarity, and comparative advantage, that is between the African Union and the RECs. The proximity of the RECs and REMs to the theaters of conflicts make them the natural first point of recourse to those in conflict and the implementation of the Peace and Security Council decisions. A review of the Peace and Security Council response to conflict situations in Madagascar, DRC, Mali, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Dakar, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan in 2013 shows that these conflicts were significantly shaped by SADC, the ICGLR, ECOWAS, ECAS, and ICAD accordingly. For better coordination between the AU and RECs, a new protocol was signed to amend the previous one, and the summer summit became a coordination summit between them. Now, moving to the adoption of legal instruments. As a former legal counsel who spent about 4 years in that position, I do believe that within the reform process, the adoption of legal instruments in the form of treaties should be revised. Why? Because we have treaties that fail to garner enough support to enter into force since the early years of the OAU. Having said that, I think it's important to note that for an idea to become a treaty, it comes from either the Commission or member states, and sometimes from partners. I think our approach should be more realistic in relation to what can be implemented on the ground. Why am I saying that? Because I have witnessed some of the ideas that ended up in a treaty during my tenure, and they failed to garner support despite the attempt from some of our states or some of the partners to make sure that the treaty is adopted so quickly without taking into consideration the real political context and dynamics that the treaty may be, yes, adopted, but not entered into force. Anyways, just to let you know that the idea starts to come in either decisions or reports, then it receives focus, probably in the special technical committees and sometimes the Executive Council, where member states request the Commission to elaborate on the idea, provide a report and possible provisions for a treaty or a statute, depending on the legal instruments that are discussed. Hence, the Commission, usually in collaboration with experts or independent consultants, prepare the first draft of the document to be submitted before the sectorial special technical committee that requested it. Once it's adopted on the technical level, it goes to the specialized technical committee on justice and legal affairs prior to its submission to the Executive Council and or the Assembly for its final adoption. Let me give you just an idea in real terms, like just to give an example. The AMA Treaty to establish the African Medicine Agency, it came as an idea, then it came in reports, it had been studied, then the idea came into fruition, and the member states decided they want to establish the African Medicine Agency. After the decision is adopted, that is on the level of the Ministers of Health in the Specialized Technical Committee for Health. After this, once they finalize the idea, they ask the Commission to bring in a report, the pros and cons of the idea and possible provisions for the statute in that context. After the elaboration and having a provision document with all the details, the Commission tabled that to the Specialized Technical Committee on Health for the Ministers of Health to decide whether they agree with these provisions, they want to amend, and they negotiate that document. Once it's finalized on the level of the Ministers of Health, it goes to the STC on Justice and Legal Affairs for the Ministers of Justice to do the same and do the legal scrubbing and make sure nothing in the document contradicts the other rules of the Union. So this goes from the Health to the Justice. Once the Ministers of Justice approve it, it goes to the Executive Council for final consideration and adoption. Once the decision is adopted, it depends on the type of the document. Some of the documents require only the Executive Council, others require the adoption by the Assembly. Hence, once it's adopted and the decision of the adoption is authenticated and published in the official journal of the AU, it enters into force 30 days. That is the document itself. But if it's a treaty, then it will be open for signatures and ratifications afterwards. This is just to give you an idea how it runs in the African Union, this kind of decision-making. There is no clear rule on how within the AU it is decided which document can remain a soft law and what can formulate a treaty. Moreover, the reform process has led to some discrepancies between what is adopted in decisions and what is in treaties. This brings about major difficulties in a political house. I have to say, when a legal council has to keep reminding member states that hard law is higher than soft law, meaning that treaties are higher than decisions, consequently, there is a process now attempting to harmonize these kind of rules that were adopted. And unfortunately, this kind of discrepancy lead to a lot of legal opinions where basically the legal counsel is attacked for political reasons, but not because what he or she put in the legal opinion is wrong. It's about soft law versus hard law. Before I conclude today, I think it's important to highlight the impact of what I just mentioned on the implementation of decisions and rules within the AU. I will definitely start by saying that we are facing fragmentation of rules that require attention from member states, as it negatively affects the implementation. It's worth noting that there is a false impression that some states are against the reform. I would dare to say that none is against the reform. However, the problem is the adherence to hard law versus soft law, as I just mentioned. Now, let me translate that into practice. In simple terms, if there is a decision from the Assembly that alters a rule in a treaty or a protocol, we end up with two contradictory legal systems that need to be applied. The older stems from a hard law, while the most recent comes in a decision. So how is it expected that the Commission will be able to smoothly implement them? This is, of course, leads to problems in implementation, as some member states would like to carry out their obligations coming from decisions, while others insist on carrying out the obligations arising from the treaty. Of course, as I mentioned, at the end, we are required in the Office of the Legal Counsel, at least that happened during my tenure, to furnish a lot of legal opinions where the opinions are attacked for not being pragmatic enough to assist member states in the process. The other hurdle that I see regarding the implementation of decisions is in relation to the sanctions. Apart from unconstitutional change of government and financial arrears sanctions, the rules pertaining to sanctions due to the lack of carrying out the decisions is not implemented. I do hope that the reform process will be able to reconcile a lot of the issues that I highlighted to keep us moving forward towards integration and development. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Negin, for that very comprehensive and thorough assessment of the AU decision-making process and the various procedures and actors, but also importantly, the implication of this processes and procedures on a number of contemporary issues, including the reform of the African Union, which we'll also be speaking more in detail later on. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Solomon, who is also the founding director of Amani Africa, who will be giving us a bit of his insights and the main findings of Amani Africa on the kind of mapping we did on the actors and the decision-making process of the AU. And you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Bitania, for giving me the floor. I would like to start off by extending my greetings. A very good afternoon or good morning, distinguished members of the panel sitting next to me, and also the other members of the panel joining us virtually. I would like to thank, first of all, the Embassy of Australia for the partnership in the conduct of this study, its publication, and indeed this convening that we are having today. At Amani Africa, we are grateful that through this partnership, we are able to engage in this mapping exercise, which we hope would be useful for various African Union actors and stakeholders in understanding the African Union, the various actors engaged in African Union decision-making processes, and indeed the African Union decision-making process itself, so that they have a much more meaningful engagement in the African Union processes. I also wish to express my appreciation to Ambassador Hope for joining us today. Ambassador Hope is the ambassador of Rwanda. Rwanda having been the champion of the reform process of the African Union, but also serving as chair of the African Union in 2018. Ambassador Hope brings a very practical insight, very rich practical insight on this matter, which often, tends to be not the most exciting of subject matter to discuss, but extremely important subject matter. I also wish to thank Ambassador Namira for joining us, and importantly for sharing with us her extremely rich and also practical insights in the way that she did, highlighting how the different actors engage in AU decision-making processes, what those actors are, and also, of course, importantly, how the decision-making process works and what governs the decision-making process, and the factors that influence the decision-making process, including, of course, in an organization like the African Union, politics is one of those factors. I also wish to thank my colleagues and distinguished friend, Professor Thomas, and also my dear sister, Fata, for also joining us this afternoon. So first of all, I think, I'd like to just say a couple of points about, the scope of this mapping exercise. We engaged in this mapping exercise on the occasion of the 20 years anniversary of the African Union's launch in 2002. We have 2 decades of practice of the African Union in decision makings of various kinds, as Ambassador Namira mentioned, addressing a wide range of subjects, from regional integration to peace and security, governance, and international relations as well. Our purpose is basically to asking a set of few questions in that respect. In our engagement with diplomats, both African Union member state diplomats and others, partners and international organizations who are assigned here in Addis, in the course of our engagement, one of the things that we have recognized is the fact that it takes a great deal of time and effort for diplomats and officials of international organizations to get a grasp of how the African Union works and which are the institutions and actors in the African Union. And of course, we also observe that in the study of international organizations, there are gaps, very serious gaps, about how the African Union is portrayed, perceived. And we thought that in terms of also popularizing the African Union, particularly in academia and scholarship, it would be worthwhile to engage in this kind of mapping exercise. So what we did is really asking the question, what are the actors that have a role in African Union decision-making? What are the sources of their role in African Union decision-making? And what are the decision-making processes of the African Union? And this, by its nature, tends to be more of a technical, legal analysis, but also it tends to be an analysis of the actors and the institutions, without necessarily implying the passing of judgment. It basically tries to really bring out, based on analysis of various sources, both formal sources, but also the practice of the African Union in various institutions. We also ask the question of what kind of institution is the African Union, because we recognize that there was a major development and transformation that happened in the year 2000. That is the transformation from what was the Organization of African Unity to that of the African Union. And there is always a question, basically, Thomas may touch on this issue, I'm sure. That is one of the areas that he has done a lot of research. Usually in scholarship, the African Union is treated in the same way that the Organization of African Union is treated. This is an intergovernmental organization where member states do what they will. That is the kind of imagination or perception that is out there. But the question is whether or not the transformation that happened from the OU to the AU actually is a continuity of this kind, where member states do what they will as long as they agree among themselves. And the submission that we are making on the basis of our analysis, also drawing on the question of whether an international organization is intergovernmental or supranational, we tried to make a submission that there are certain aspects of the African Union that makes it completely different from, and indeed represent a paradigmatic change from what was the Organization of African Unity. And some of the simplest of measures have to do with basically, if you look at the scale of objectives of the OAU and that of the African Union, and the norms and principles to which the OAU was committed to, and what the African Union is now committed to in terms of scale and depth, as well as the list of institutions that you have as part of the African Union. This is just on the surface kind of thing. But if you look at, normatively speaking, the nature of the commitment that member states have made under the African Union, you definitely would come to see that the African Union doesn't fit this binary classification of intergovernmental or supranational. And that is the submission that we are making, that there are aspects of the African Union that makes it intergovernmental, but the African Union is not exclusively intergovernmental, that it has certain supranational attributes, which basically means there are certain obligations that are binding on member states. There are certain decisions when they are taken at the level of the African Union would have consequences for member states, including at the national level. This obviously doesn't mean that it is a fully fledged supranational institution where its decisions would have direct application in the national jurisdiction or legal system of member states. That's not what we are submitting here. The other thing that you see, as Ambassador Namira mentioned, is there are certain authorities that have been assigned to the African Union, including in terms of membership in the African Union, for example. During the Organization of African Unity's time, any member state may end up having any kind of government coming to power through any means. It doesn't matter what the means is. That state would remain a member of the African Union. So there was no rule that excludes those countries whose government come to power through an illegal or unconstitutional means. So one of the major departures, therefore, that you see in the African Union is the adoption of these kinds of norms relating to, for example, the principle of non-indifference under Article 4H of the Constitutive Act, the ban of unconstitutional change of government. And it's worth noting that these two have a higher status than other norms, arguably, in the African Union system, because they are entrenched in the grand norm of the African Union, which is the founding treaty, the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Both Article 4H and then another provision in Article 4 states that the Union rejects unconstitutional change of government. But it didn't stop there. It went on to actually entrench even a decision for suspending member states in the event of unconstitutional change of government. All of these are in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, and indicating to us that these things have been happening and being enforced, all right, and therefore with various consequences to member states in terms of their engagement in the African Union, but also importantly, diplomatically, politically, in terms of their international standing, reputationally, and the engagement of international actors with these countries. So drawing on this, we have therefore concluded that we can't just reduce the African Union to purely intergovernmental organization. And this obviously sets the background to the work that we have done. And we built these based on, of course, analytical framework that we have we have presented in order to help us, follow through the thread, so to speak, in the analysis that we did. In terms of the architecture of the African Union, I think one thing that is worth mentioning is the Assembly of the African Union is the supreme organ, and it is as such the highest decision-making body of the African Union. Pending the establishment of the African Court of Justice and Human Rights, it has also arrogated to itself the role of interpreting the Constitutive Act of the African Union. So this is really the most dominant, if you like, the most dominant of African Union decision-making actors, and that sits, at the apex of African Union decision-making. This obviously leads us to ask the question whether or not what we have is a kind of a top-down decision-making process, a kind of a pyramid, architecture, so to speak. The Assembly sits at the top. Next to it is the the Executive Council. Then there are various, actors that come in there. For example, if you look at the reporting lines, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, as Ambassador Namira mentioned, doesn't report through the Executive Council. It rather reports directly to the Assembly. So if you look at the diagram, we connected the PSC to the Assembly on that basis. We have the PRC that obviously is under the Executive Council, and then we have also the special technical committees, which report to the Executive Council. And if you see the diagram, below that comes the African Union Commission and the different other organs of the African Union. And within the African Union Commission, what we call the bureaucracy of the African Union. And the bureaucracy of the African Union consists not only of the African Union Commission, which is the principal administrative, secretarial, and technical body of the African Union, very key for the day-to-day running of the African Union, but also the secretariats of other African Union institutions as well. Those are what we call the bureaucracy of the African Union. Because there are certain bodies of the African Union who have their own, administrative institutions for the administrative work of theirs, such as, for example, the registrar of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, by way of example. And then you have, of course, importantly, the various advisory and consultative bodies of the African Union. Then you also have the specialized and technical agencies of the African Union. As Ambassador mentioned earlier on, these basically are spread across the continent, but we have made a distinction between those that have, significant role in decision making, and those, that have, the role of really implementing programs that have been adopted by the major decision-making organs of the African Union. And the way we pictorially try to represent is you have the primary decision-making actors. Then you have under them what you may consider to be secondary decision-making actors. Then you have regional economic communities. Then you have what may be called actors external to AU's formal structures. And we make a submission that in order to understand the African Union, it's important to think in terms of an ecosystem. The African Union and its institutions do not operate in isolation, but they operate in an ecosystem made up of various stakeholders and actors, including, importantly, the wider African public, which would consist of civil society organizations in their various formations, the media, the private sector, prominent personalities. All of these, although they are not formally part and parcel of the decision-making process, they play very important roles in the ecosystem in which the African Union operates, and they form part of that ecosystem. And we also include in these partners writ large, whether they are multilateral partners or individual state partners. Now, quickly, in terms of AU decision-making actors and processes, the way we presented this is by saying the African Union powers and functions, and the powers and functions of its various institutions is such that you actually can consider the African Union as an international organization that is engaged in lawmaking, in law implementation as well. The laws may take different forms. I mean, and when I use the law, I think it's important to understand this is a reference not only to binding legal treaties that Ambassador Namira made reference to, but also other forms of decisions that the African Union takes. So if the African Union is engaged in some form of lawmaking, then it's also and implementation, as well as if there are actors that are engaged in some form of judicial decision making, then we make a submission that we can categorize African Union decision making actors into legislative bodies, executive bodies, and judicial bodies. Then outside of that, we have the advisory and consultative bodies. We have the RECs. Then we have others in which non-state actors and partners would fall. This is how we have identified the different actors. In terms of the legislative bodies, it's worth mentioning that some of the legislative actors are primary legislative actors, such as Assembly, the Executive Council, and probably, I mean, this can be a kind of a borderline, the spatial and technical committees of the African Union. And then we have what we call quasi-legislative bodies. Quasi-legislative bodies. And these are basically bodies who, through the mandate that is interested to them, also produce guidelines, principles, general comments, which fall in the category of what are regarded as soft law, which have the potential even to become hard law in the course of time. Sometimes the production of, for example, model laws. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, for example, adopted a model law on freedom of on access to information, which has been used by large number of member states as a basis for elaborating their legislation on access to information. So you have quasi-judicial bodies. And then it's important here to also include what I call legislation processing actors. These are the actors who do not have, actual legislative power, and therefore they don't legislate, but they are critical for the processing of those legislations once they are drafted. All right. Here I'm referring to the African Union Commission. I am also referring to the PRC. The PRC is the actor with the heavy workload as far as the processing of documents is concerned. The African Union Commission, on the other hand, is the body that kind of holds the pen, so to speak. And therefore, it is the one that produces the working documents of all the for the decision-making actors, including for the one that the Permanent Representatives Committee actually processes. And that processing involves, for the Permanent Representatives Committee, as Ambassador Namira mentioned, reviewing, changing as necessary, and of course, it is expected that those changes comply with established binding legal decisions of the African Union itself. All right. It is after the filtering happened at the level of the PRC that things would go up to the Executive Council and then to the Assembly. Of course, there is the other route that the role of special technical committees play. These are sectoral institutions of the African Union with a specialization on specific areas. Of course, we classify them into two. Those that are, sectoral, broadly speaking, and we separate the STC on justice and legal affairs, because the STC on justice and legal affairs basically has to be the one looking into all legal instruments that would be submitted to the Executive Council, including those that are brought from, for example, on the proposal of the other special and technical committees of the African Union. It's worth mentioning here, I mean, because this is a very extensive report, about 60 pages, I wouldn't be able to go into the specifics. So what I would do now is to give you also a highlight of the decision-making process as we have, collated and analyzed. Now, the decision-making process, follows similar patterns with other international organizations. So it involves agenda setting. Basically, agenda is proposed. Once there is agreement on that agenda, then the agenda is basically put in place. Following agenda setting, you would actually go to the next stage, and that stage is basically the stage, the preparatory stage, where preparatory work by those various actors, has to take place. The consultation in particular, all right, on how to proceed with that particular agenda item. Based on that, then there would be a drafting, and the drafting, as Ambassador Namira mentioned, it may involve the use of external resources, such as experts, for example, for the drafting of working documents, for the drafting of, particularly when it is treaty, you need that kind of engagement. Then the drafting, once it is, looked into by the African Union Commission and the necessary, compliance processes are done, then you go to the deliberation stage. Okay, here, this is where things are placed in the meetings of the Permanent Representatives Committee, the meeting of the STC, and the meetings of the other primary decision-making or policy-making bodies of the African Union. But at the legislation processing stage, at the level of the African Union Commission and that of the PRC or the STC, changes would be made to the draft, and the draft is made ready for submission and consideration by the higher entity. This could be the Executive Council, and then from the Executive Council, it goes up to the African Union Assembly. So that stage would be what we call the consideration and adoption stage of the decision making process of the African Union. I think there are important dynamics that need to be borne in mind. The way I put it now makes it sound like it is a linear process. It's not a linear process. The agenda may be set or initiated through various ways and mechanisms, and various actors play in the setting of agenda for decision-making in the African Union system. It could be something that comes on the proposal of member states of the African Union, or on the proposal of members of the SCC, or on the proposal of other organs of the African Union, or it may be coming from the interaction of African Union institutions with other actors, whether these are regional economic communities or non-state actors or partners of the African Union or its institutions. It's worth mentioning that in terms of decision-making, the mechanics of decision-making are also, outlined specifically on the Assembly, on the PRC, and that of, importantly, the Executive Council as well. And one thing that we also identified is usually the African Union institutions take decisions by consensus. This is basically a tradition, a diplomatic tradition in the African continent, but I don't think that it is unique to the African continent. You would find this in, for example, Asia as well, and indeed in other international organizations as well. Usually consensus is, portrayed as a weakness. Certainly there are problems with consensus, but in an organization of 55 member states, given the size, in an environment where the level of support that the decision takes matters in terms of the level of implementation that it may have, consensus can be an important vehicle. But there is, of course, a rule that these institutions can take decisions by a majority vote as well. Ordinarily, this doesn't happen. This doesn't mean that the African Union institutions do not take decisions without consensus. They do take decisions even when consensus is not there or various forms of consensus is available. So you may have, for example, what we may call consensus light, all right, where the depth and breadth of consensus is weak, and then that decision didn't have the support of the wider membership of the African Union. Sometimes this has led to the African Union making change in the earlier decision that it has taken, quote unquote, I quote, in order to deepen the consensus. Those are instances that, that are referred to as here, kind of consensus light. And this is the case, for example, with respect to, in the context of the institutional reform process, decisions were taken in January 2017. And then in 2018, the AU took a decision to have further consultations in order to deepen consensus on those decisions, and certain changes were introduced thereafter. Then you have what we may call consensus with exception or with reservation, which means that the decision was taken by the majority with some, whether small or significant minority not subscribing to that decision. Again, in the context of the institutional reform, for example, particularly with respect to the Peace Fund, you would find that a decision was taken in terms of the basis for calculating contributions of member states to the Peace Fund. And the initial decision was to distribute the weight of the contribution of the Peace Fund evenly across the 5 regions of the continent. But that didn't win the support of many member states. And later on, a decision was taken to make it on the basis of assessed contribution, regular assessed contribution. And this was adopted eventually, but with a reservation from countries or member states of the African Union from the northern region. So this is one important aspect. I will not delve into how the institutional reform of the African Union affected the decision-making process. There are, certain important institutional changes that happened, including at the level of the African Union Commission, how the African Union Commission functions, and the question of, limiting the role of the Assembly to strategic issues, for example, and the working methods of the African Union for the Assembly, but also for other organs as well. But one important aspect in terms of the role of various actors in decision-making worth noting is this one. While regional economic communities are recognized under the Abuja Treaty establishing the African Economic Community, as well as under the Constitutive Act of the African Union, how they engage in the decision-making process of the African Union was not clear. So as regional integration on the African continent takes place with the adoption of various treaties, including the Treaty on the African Free Trade Area, it has become clear that the relationship between the African Union and REX needs to be streamlined, needs to be clarified, but also importantly, the role of REX in decision-making process was also clarified. So under the reform, one of the things that we have witnessed is basically this one. Instead of 2 sessions per year, these are the intergovernmental conferences in which decisions are taken. A decision was taken to have 1 session per year, and then the mid-year summit of the African Union is changed into a mid-year coordination meeting of the African Union Assembly, particularly the Bureau of the Assembly and the leadership of the regional economic communities. And decisions that are taken in that platform actually feed into the regular decision-making processes of the African Union, thereby giving actually REX a seat, so to speak, not necessarily directly, but through this mid-year coordination meeting in the decision-making table of the African Union. I would conclude with a few observations. I think it's important when we think of African Union actors in decision making, we have to understand that the African Union Assembly, for example, is not a monolithic body. Decision making in the African Union Assembly are shaped by a number of factors. One of them have to do with, obviously, the actors who shape the decision making in the African Union Assembly, the chairperson of the African Union Assembly, who actually presides over the deliberations of the Assembly, who facilitates consensus, who guides the direction of the deliberation, plays an important role. Then you have the Bureau of the Assembly, the 3 deputy chairpersons made up of the 3 deputy chairpersons and the rapporteur. And of course, this structure, you would find it in the Executive Council, in the Permanent Representatives Committee of the African Union as well. These also play a very important role, formally speaking. Then you have committees of the African Union Assembly, who are tasked with special responsibilities in order to work on a certain aspect of the decision-making process of the African Union Assembly, and then bring that to the plenary, and thereby facilitating the mechanics of decision making in the assembly. Then you have, again, what we call, what the African Union calls champions, African Union champions, who champion specific thematic portfolio for the African Union, whose engagement also leads to and fits into the wider African Union Assembly decision-making process. The African Union Commission obviously plays an important role, whether it is through the African Union Commission chairperson, through the legal counsel of the African Union, or through the Secretary General of the African Union Commission, who actually, contribute to the process of decision making in the African Union, including at the level of the Assembly, assisting the African Union chairperson and indeed the larger African Union Assembly membership. These are just by way of a summary, what we have mapped out in terms of actors, in terms of the decision-making processes. Now, as you can see, even with this, you'd be left with a lot of questions hanging. Each of the African Union institutions, there is no one size fits approach to African Union decision-making. That is why you would find some decisions taking a very long time, such as, for example, the adoption of the African Union, just by example, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. From the time it was initiated on the basis of the report of the Panel of the Wise towards the end of the 2000s to its adoption in 2019, it has taken a very, very long time. Then you have certain other treaties that are actually adopted with speed, right? Such is the case, for example, with the Constitutive Act itself, but later on, its ratification as well. And later on, of course, I'm not saying that the policy and the treaty are one and the same. I'm just giving you an example how, the decision-making process is not, there's no one size fits all approach to the decision-making process, and the decision-making process in the political bodies is different from the decision-making process, for example, in the judicial organs of the African Union. With that, what we have set is a foundation for further, more in-depth, analysis of not only each of the institutions, but also importantly, how in practice, based on actually specific, decisions, based on an anatomy of how specific decisions are made, in order to highlight and shed light on how these processes and actors engage in African Union decision-making process. With that, I would like to once again thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Solomon, and for the elaborate presentation on the main findings of the report of Amani Africa, which, as you can see, it's also very extensive, and we've tried really to also highlight really the main areas that we have identified in the mapping exercise of actors and decision process and agenda setting and policy making within the African Union. And also the presentation touched upon understanding the very nature of the African Union, this debate around intergovernmental and supranational organization, and where does the AU fit in this classification. But also I think this can also be further maybe discussed and reflected around during the discussion time. The dynamics really behind decision making as well, and the actors, the kind of role actors play, not only the actors identified within certain norms, but also those that engage the African Union very closely and work within the African Union, have a lot of influence in decision making. I would like now to welcome our third speaker for this session, Professor Thomas Tieku. who's an associate professor at King's University College, University of Western Ontario. He has written extensively on international relations theories, and contextualizing these theories within the specific case of Africa and the African Union. And Professor, if you can maybe shed light on some of the dynamics in today's discussion around the decision-making of the African Union, also speaking around the actors, both within the AU system, but also those outside and around the AU that are involved in decision-making, and also speaking based on the scholarship and the extensive work you've done on the AU. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Bethany. And then I would like to thank Amani Africa for inviting me and for connecting me with wonderful people. Some of you I know from different parts of the world, and some of you I may be meeting online for the first time. So it's a pleasure to be here and to get an opportunity to talk about African mapping of the African Union decision-making actors and processes. Let me also begin by congratulating Amani Africa for the incredible work you've been doing in helping us to understand the work of the African Union. Those of us in the academic setting, we find the work of Amani Africa incredibly important. And I'm always looking forward to your newsletter and then your emails all the time. So thank you for helping us and for allowing us and for deepening our understanding of the African Union, particularly the African peace and security architecture. The first point that I like to put on the table is that, and which will be my main, my central point that I would want to convey, is that the African Union as a coordinator of African decision-making actors and processes, the AU would have been created today if it did not already exist. And that is how important it has been as a coordinating unit of actors and processes on the African continent. Let me try to unpack this particular statement that I've made by talking about what I consider to be the three main parts of the African Union. So in the literature, we tend to think about the African Union not just as one organization, but what we call a three-dimensional organization. That it's the African Union of heads of state. So we have to think about the actors there and the processes there. And Solomon and the first speaker and the speakers before me have done a wonderful job of highlighting that aspect of the African Union. And then there's an African Union of international civil servants headed by the chairperson of the commission as a separate. And if it works well, they should not necessarily do the bidding of each member state, but rather the broader interests of the continental Africa, which often sometimes may be different from the narrow interests of each member state and what they are looking for. So sometimes there can be a tension there, which is sometimes is very healthy, and sometimes there can be coordination. So, and then there's an African Union of what I call, or the part that I call the outside insiders or outside insiders. These are actors who, and Solomon did a wonderful job of giving us an idea of what these actors are. These are actors and processes that are not former members of the organization, but their ideas and their activities shape the African Union in a fundamental way. I'll give you one example. It will be difficult for you to understand the kind of laws that have emerged or the kind of rules that have emerged within the AU system without paying attention to the work of the Pan-African Lawyers Union, for example, and their influences on it. Also be difficult to understand what has happened without even some of the African think tanks, including Amani Africa, Institute for Security Studies, and so on and so forth. So these are very important actors, but they don't have a formal standing within the organization. But when you are thinking about processes as well as actors in shaping in the decision-making, we cannot lose sight of these actors, although their work often is through an informal channel. Okay. So I wanted to put that on. But since the AU of heads of state or AU of government is well known and has been talked about, I would like to focus my remarks on the AU of international bureaucrats. In the literature, we call them Africrats, African bureaucrats. So we use the word Africrats to describe. And then I will touch on the outside insiders, actors in a little bit. So I'm leaving the former organs and the former, the AU affairs of state, not because I don't think that they're important. They are very important after all. It's the heart of the African Union, but I wanted to share more light on the Africats because I think the Africats have been very important. And their role, interestingly, is often understated and underappreciated within the governance structure of the African Union, unless you work with them on a daily basis, or you are international junkie like me who pays so much attention to international organization and pays attention to the nitty-gritty of it. I have recently talked about the 6 roles that these Africrats have played in shaping not just only African continent, but the politics beyond the continent. So I will not go into, but during the discussion time, I will be happy to touch on it. But I wanted to point out that these Africrats that often who work behind the scenes, and often we don't give them enough credit, have been incredible in terms of innovation and ideas that the AU has been able to introduce into the international governance architecture. Sometimes we don't appreciate that much how much innovations that AU has introduced into the international governance architecture. And so let me give you one innovation that often sometimes as Africans, we don't appreciate it that much. And I sometimes wish that we appreciate it so much. And that is the co-management governance system at the senior management level of the African Union in terms of the decision-making process. The African Union, in terms of international governance structure, is the only international organization where you have a chairperson who is supposed to be the head of the organization, but shares powers with a deputy and cannot hire and fire the deputy, right? So that's a co-management system, and it's a system where commissioners have some autonomy and leverage to make independent decision-making. I know that sometimes that has created a difficulty and controversy, but this is a distinctive African innovation in international governance as architecture. In most international organizations, we have a single corporate governance system where we have the head that often appoints everyone and can fire and then hire all of them. When the top is rotten, often the rest of the system gets rotten. And when the AUC or the commission was being designed, a number of astute Pan-Africanists who have worked within the UN system and work within other international organizations recognized that we needed to introduce a different management system where powers are diffused within the system and where the chairperson, deputy share some powers and commissioners have also got the autonomy. So if it works well, the deputy actually is supposed to run the shop within the African Union. And that's why administration is under the deputy chairperson of the African Union, while the chairperson is the accounting officer. So there's a checks and balances within that particular system. This is an African innovation in international governance structure you can't find anywhere. And that's why sometimes there's a little bit of controversy, because if you look around the international system, we have this single corporate structure. We know it doesn't really work effectively. And there's a tendency often to copy rather than to pay close attention to actually what has been designed for the African continent. And there has been an attempt in some cases to move or to impose the single corporate model on the African governance architecture, which I think will be a strategic mistake. Yes, although it doesn't give one individual or one office the power to be able to do everything they want to do, but if you are political scientists, we always design institutions with the view that human beings by nature we like to control, and they would like power. And therefore, if you concentrate power in the hands of one area, it tends to create difficulty. So power corrupt and power corrupt, absolutely. So you see that particular phrase that we often, so this particular governance model depends on a lot of negotiation between the chairperson and the deputy chairperson, between the commissioners, in a way that allows deliberation and a nuanced decision making. And often people often don't appreciate the importance of that particular arrangement in terms of bringing out. And I think it's based on this idea that knowledge does not reside, or good decision does not reside in only one place, that you have different institutions that come together and work together, it will create. So I wanted to highlight this what I call the co-management international system. It's not perfect. It has its limitations, but as a decision-making body and processes, it is way better and superior to the single corporate management structure. And it's built based on lessons learned from the weaknesses of the corporate of a single corporate system. Let me here give in particular, highlight the importance of the former, the late Nigerian Pan-Africanist and international diplomat par excellence, Margaret Vogt's work in trying to push for this particular idea. So may her soul rest in peace. But it has been very important in terms of as a new innovation in international governance architecture. I wanted to pay attention, but we don't talk about it that much. That's why I want to use this particular forum to be able to touch on it, except in academic setting that we usually tend to highlight it. The second point that I like to make in terms of as a decision-making actors and processes, and often we also tend not to emphasize is it's the international civil servants who operate within the African Union. Now I'm talking about the 1,000 or around approximately 1,720 international civil servants who work within the African Union, commissioned at the headquarters and the individual offices. And I'm quoting 1,720 because that's the last data that I have that we did. The data set just before the COVID. They have been very instrumental in terms of the decision making that we've made. And for those of us who pay attention to international civil service, or international bureaucracy, we are much more interested in them because the research that we know shows that countries that have got solid and good bureaucracy tend to have a higher living standard. And actually the correlation between solid and good bureaucracy and a living standard is actually stronger than the correlation between a higher living standard and that of the practice of democracy. So having a stronger bureaucracy is very, very, very important for us. And for a continent where our bureaucracies are not the strongest, having around 1720 international civil servants, highly educated, complementing the work of the African civil service is an extremely important and can only be good for the African continent. And I wanted to highlight this as well for us. And anytime we're thinking about decision making, we should not think about these individuals as just people who just only push papers and therefore they don't have an important decision making, important role to play in the decision making of the continent. Excuse me. This is why I think the broader point I want to make though is that the reason why I wanted to bring them in is that there's a perception within some quarters within the African Union and even outside of the African Union that somehow we have too many people who are working within the African Union, and we need less of it. So sometimes you hear the language of a lean African Union. In actual fact, African Union is one of the smallest international organizations if you look at it in terms of the bureaucratic structure. We need more of it. And actually, if you do research properly, you need twice as much as we have at the moment. The 1,700 is actually not enough for a continent or an organization made up of 55 governments. Just for comparative purposes, take the European Union, which members are, the European Union has closer to 33,000 core staff, right? And if you take all the auxiliary staff together, they are going, you are heading towards almost close to 50,000 organizations, 38,000, over 38,000 international bureaucrats supporting it. So we haven't, African Union having only 1,720 or thereabout is not actually a strong bureaucratic structure, and is a very bottom, apart from that, is also very bottom heavy international organization. Bottom heavy in the sense that most of the staff are concentrated at the lower half of the bureaucracy in terms of decision making. So from the professional level, P1 up to P4. And statistically, the last time we did the data, the data suggests that 73% of the entire AU bureaucrats are located in the bottom half of the organization. This does not in any way suggest that these individuals are not technically solid individuals or that they are lower skilled workers or staff of international bureaucracy. In actual fact, the survey that we did suggests that over 80% of AU staff from the professional level have a master's degree or a higher degree, and they have extensive experience prior to joining the African Union. So in other words, the AUC has provided us with a space where a number of technically savvy African civil servants are increasingly getting together in a way that is supporting the work of the African Union and helping us to make a decision. I'm not suggesting that all of them are perfect. We are a human institution. They are by no means perfect, or is not by no means a very a perfect organization. But the point I'm trying to suggest is that we need more of this. We need to provide more spaces for more savvy African technical people to be able to work within the Organization of African Union. The idea that we are paying, and there's perception within some quarters that somehow these individuals are over rewarded. But we know from research that actually the work that they are doing, it is too much on them. And sometimes some of us feel that they are magicians in terms of their ability to do the sort of things that they do. And we know that there are no magicians in bureaucracy. So it means that sometimes we overburden them with work, or in most cases, we are not giving them all the tools that they need to work. And sometimes when you do that, it's either you get people who are super motivated and they overwork themselves to the ground, or sometimes they are discouraged and they only do the little that they are doing. So if we're really serious in terms of pursuing the Agenda 20, we have to take a closer look at the bureaucratic structure that we have in terms of decision making. So I wanted to put that on the table. I also think the AU AU would have been invented today if it did not already exist, because of the space that it has provided for outside insiders, such as think tanks, consultants, commission of inquiries, special envoys, former heads of state, to bring innovative ideas and solutions to the table for African policymakers. If you look at the continent, if you compare the last 20 years to the previous 20 years, there has been a number of innovations coming from the African continent. And this is because the AU has provided a particular space for African think tanks, African innovators to work with these international bureaucrats to bring out these particular ideas. I can cite many of them, but I will just only highlight only a couple of them. If you take a look at the Malabo Protocol, for example, and I know that the former AU lawyer is here, so I think it would be good to cite that example. If you look through that protocol as a human rights document, it contains a number of global firsts. like a number of things that you don't find it in most international legal texts. You find it in the Malabo Protocol. And this came as a result of the AUC working with member states and the Commission, and in particular working with the Pan-African Lawyers Union to bring out these particular innovations. And I find it extremely important, wonderful development on the continent. If you cast your mind back to 20 years before, these ideas would have been found out to extra or external actor outside of African continent to be able to do this job. But this time, it's something that came within from the continent of Africa, and I find it extremely important. Let me take another example of which the founding director of Amani Africa knows a thing or two about it. So I want to take the African Union's transitional justice policy framework. It's one of the most innovative transitional justice policy framework that you can ever find under the planet, anywhere else in the world, right? And this happened, and it didn't come from anywhere. It came from within Africa, where the African Union and people like, Amani, the founding director of Amani Africa, working closely with the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, providing the technical support to bring out these very innovative, African-oriented kind of ideas back onto the table for policy making. So the broader point I'm trying to say is that the AU opening up the space for interaction between outside insiders and that of the AU bureaucrats have really created a space for a lot of policy innovations and policy inventions on the African continent. We can talk about the implementation, which is, by the way, not the fault of this bureaucrat, but rather it is the fault of the member state, although there's often a tendency to make them a scapegoat, which is the normal thing often to do. But the problem is that the ideas are there. Whether they are implemented is a separate matter altogether. But I wanted to put this particular thing on the table. It has also helped us as a continent to increasingly wean ourselves from ideas and policies that often came from outside of the continent, external actors. And I'm reminded, for example, that in the 80s and the early 1990s, most of the African ideas or policy practices would either come from international financial institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, and so on and so forth. I think we are now getting a much more African-based kind of ideas emerging. And for me, this is thanks to the African Union and in particular the international civil servants that we have across the African continent. Okay. I hope, and then this is one point, this is the last part, one point that I would like to make on this particular point. Although this space has been created for international civil servants and then for OTSADA to play a very important role, I think because we were building the AU a little bit and then confidence was not too high, the emphasis was placed on bringing outsiders and insiders who are often not critical enough and who don't often tell the AU what they need to hear. I'm hoping that as AU moves into the next phase of its life, and particularly given that it is maturing as an institution, and we know that you get to know if an institution is matured or even a human being is mature, depending on how they receive constructive feedback and criticisms and second opinion. I'm hoping that as we move forward, the AU would open the space, not only for outside and insiders who will tell the AU what it wants to hear, but more importantly, open the space for outside insiders who will tell the AU and the powers that be what they need to hear. I will leave it here, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor Teku, for that contribution, particularly for speaking around the innovation that the African Union has introduced, particularly with regards to leadership, co-management, and the kind of autonomy it has provided for the various commissioners within the Commission, but also talking about a component which usually overlooked in decision-making, the role of bureaucrats, and how, despite the important role bureaucrats play still, the African Union Commission has a very small-sized bureaucracy. And I believe there's a lot of work that needs to be done around that. And for speaking also another layer of around the other layer of actors that you spoke around, the insider actors, and the kind of innovation they also brought for various landmark policies and norms within the African Union. Thank you very much for that contribution. And now I'd like to welcome Ambassador Hope Tumukunde, who's the permanent representative of Rwanda to the African Union. And as indicated earlier, Ambassador Hope is also was the PRC chair of the African Union in 2018. And Rwanda being also the champion of this reform process of the African Union, we would like to hear more to your insights, particularly in relation to the institutional reform, and also how that's the implication of the reform on the decision-making aspect of the African Union. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, moderator. Good afternoon, everyone, to the panelists, those who are in the house and those connected online. I want to first of all thank Amani for inviting me and the partners for supporting this initiative, very important, especially for non-insider stakeholders to know the nitty-gritties of the whole process of decision-making, even actors that continue to expand and grow within every other year. And I'm sure the way we are seated here, we are also, in a way, indirectly taking part in decision-making process of the AU. So as Dr. Solomon was explaining how that apex is, explaining how the summit, the assembly is the highest, decision-making organ. It's the summit, but a summit that is really broad and open and complex, if I may, and really welcoming. It's really broad, and because the assembly meets for two days, the executive council meets for 2 days, maybe the PRC meets for a longer time, and we are permanent, but still there are a lot of events that happen that feed into any decision that is taken in February of each year. So I wanted to first, I know everything has been said, but I wanted to emphasize that the AU is so broad and welcoming and open to ideas and inputs throughout that year. But even especially around the assembly itself, the assembly of the union. I remember now that you asked in 2018 when we were chairing, at one time we had, because we prepared the program of events to see how to synchronize them and organize. And at one time we had more than 30 side events. What does that mean? It means that partners travel all over from all over, and they are in Addis. There is an event in Hyatt a day before. There is an event in Sheraton 2 days before. There is an event in another hotel in the evening. Some actually conflict with the main meetings. What does that mean? It means that all of them are struggling, and they are welcome to provide inputs in the mainstream process of decision making. So what does that mean? It means that actors are not only the AU policy organs that we are talking about, of the Assembly, the Executive Council, the PRC, other organs, but those are direct decision makers or direct actors, but there are others actually that are indirect in terms of partners, in terms of accredited non-AU member states, in terms of civil society, in terms of researchers that have reports like this. So it's really it's an open, and that's why it is like that as a summit, as Dr. Solomon explained. So the Assembly comes maybe to own, to bless, or not, if it's necessary. There are very few decisions that just come at that level, especially when they come through the committees, the Assembly committees, as explained, the champions, or other ad hoc assigned activities. So I wanted to emphasize that first. But actors, we have the Assembly, the Executive Council, but even the Executive Council, when you are in that room, it's not only ministers of foreign affairs. They are representatives of REX and all other organs, and much as they might not speak, but they influence and they advise. And all the AU organs, especially every 6 months or every year, they bring their reports. And those reports, they are usually accompanied by especially challenges, observations, but especially proposed decisions. That is a standard requirement. So it's a proposal of a decision, which through the PRC it is subject to scrutiny, and then eventually modified or enriched, eventually owned up by the policy organ. So I wanted to emphasize that, and to say that the AU with its organs, the African Union Commission with the bureaucrats and the staff, because these are the pen holders, and there is a lot of power in drafting. Changing what is drafted takes, sometimes it's missed out, sometimes it takes a lot of discussion to remove it. So there is a lot of power in drafting through a department, through an organ, through the commission itself. So I believe, for me, that is a powerful actor, much as it's not at the Assembly, but drafting a proposal of a treaty or a decision. It's very important. And then we have STCs, which are sector meetings, which can take decisions of themselves, or they also forward them to the Executive Council and the Assembly. We also have African technical institutions, that do a lot and are invited to speak, to report. This is very important, and it's very important to really, appreciate the role that they play in that. And partners, as I said earlier, partners and accredited institutions that are invited at the opening of each assembly every year. That presence in the opening means a lot, because because that's what actually COVID had taken away, because people were not meeting, especially around assemblies, we're meeting virtually. So we had missed a lot of insights and ideas. After all, what is a decision? It starts as an idea. As the former legal counsel, my sister Namira, I was so glad to hear her. It starts as an idea, and then you organize, just as we meet here, we deliberate, as long as we convince each other, and then take it to another level. Because another thing I wanted to emphasize is that the decision-making process of the AU is by consensus. It was explained. consensus which is not unanimity, of course, which can attract a reservation as 1 or 2 members would be not comfortable, but it is decided. And of course, that has its own disadvantage because consensus, for those who are experts in negotiations, it takes a little more time because you want to go, or, like the saying goes that if you want to go fast, you go alone, you walk alone or travel alone. If you want to travel together, I mean I don't know, how do they say? So, but it is slow, but it makes sure that everyone is on board. I don't know how we want to look at that as I don't want to see it as a disadvantage. It makes sure that we are all together. In every step we are taking, it might be a slow step, but we are together. So I don't want to consider that as an efficiency because you had mentioned some of the gaps. I don't want to look at. The other thing I wanted to emphasize in decision making is that feeding into each other, cascading upwards, from each level, especially when a decision is sensitive and it can't be taken at a lower level. It has to go until the summit level, the assembly level. But that process itself, the consultation that happens, the scrutiny, the scrubbing, and assisted by the Office of the Legal Counsel. That's one thing that we have been through this journey of reform, emphasizing that this is an office that should be highly resourced with sophisticated and officials, that legal experts that can listen and draft quickly and and finalize a decision that really meets all the standards, and even comparing, looking and behind and advising accordingly. So that's very important in that process, from the initiator of the decision or of the idea up to the level a decision is taken or a policy document is adopted, or so those two elements are very important to note in the process of decision making of the AU, consensus based, but again they cascade and feed into each other. Some might stay at a level, but then when you want a binding decision, it has to go up to the highest level. The challenges, I don't want to dwell on that because that consensus based, for me, I look at it as a positive side, but some people say it's a challenge. Being slow but sure is very important. But again, the other challenge I wanted to say is that being open and welcoming and feeding into, sometimes decisions are taken, too many of them, but then the challenge is on the side of implementation. That's why one part of the reform came into to see how to implement the decisions. Right now, there is an ad hoc committee to look into each decision that was not implemented and to see how fast it can be, they can all be implemented. And the other challenge, at least that I've seen, especially during chairing the PRC or even other levels, the minister chairing or my president chairing the assembly, sometimes members get stuck within their national interests, if I may, or boundaries. And it requires a lot of negotiating, such that you build that consensus beyond member states' boundaries or interests. Even such few reservations that happen, they happen because of such. So that is a challenge, but again, the slow nature, the consultation nature, the long process nature helps members to come on board and even to accommodate each other, which is very good. The other one is that the whole process, or the AU, Dr. Solomon mentioned, the intergovernmental versus the supranational. I think the AU is largely an intergovernmental, largely. This means what? It means that the Commission, as we have it, or the AU, lacks some power sometimes to push on some of the things to be done. We are not like the EU, much as the AU was inspired by the integration in the EU, but we do not have that, the power, the supranational power. They are limited, as you said. So that is, but still, I would also argue that it depends on who you are, how you want to look at that. It's a plus for me, but someone else would think that is. The other challenge that we could, we are a huge organization, 55 member states. And meetings, maybe we are going to maintain a mixture of virtual and physical, but virtual has been less costly. There is a cost of engaging and being present and really participating and contributing. There is a cost, and not all countries really. Some countries are struggling. Some others are still humble economically and politically, and you find that there is that cost of being present, being always available to contribute. Some do not have embassies here in Addis. That means that it's a challenge, if you may. And then some other countries find themselves, for one reason or another, in sanctions, and thereby they are absent when decisions are taken. So those are a few of the things. So let me jump to the reform and the new things. Everything has been said, so I won't stay. I want to say there are new things that came with it, and of course that was the reason. First of all, to make sure that the assembly, the union, stays on the strategic matters. That is very important. The continental priorities, that's very important. And even reducing the 2 summits to 1 summit, and introducing the media coordination summit, which brought in a bigger role of RECs, which was absent before, much as RECs were in our Abuja Treaty, but not until recently, not until the reform, or the institutional reform came in. RECs, yes, they would attend, but they had never had this role. For example, the many months leading into the Media Coordination Summit, there is a lot of engagement with RECs, especially because they are working together on tracking the level of integration in many areas, 10 of them. There is an index, an integration index. They have to look at, together with RECs, in each REC, they look at those 10 elements. That's very important. It's a new thing that came with that is shaping the whole process of decision making, and bringing the REC as a major actor, the RECs as major actors, and then also that division of labor that that has been lacking, that is being finalized, and to see how it can, such that the assembly or the union stays with the strategic issues, and the RECs takes their rightful position, and of course at the national level. The other thing that came with the reform is to make sure that we try to realign our institution to deliver more, and even to involve youths. The voice of the young Africans was absent. We have a youth envoy, and the whole of the structure that they have been playing, and we are. For me, I'm glad that we have been having youth envoys that are female so far. That adds something. So the reform is a journey, but we have seen some of those dividends really coming into play, and also the element of financing, that continues to be discussed. But again, you can see that the union is realizing that members are realizing that we have to own our financing in our humble way, and then show that this is what we can manage, and then partners can come in. But after showing that we have done something, even consultation, yes, it happens in the process, but for me, it was the first time I saw heads of state having a retreat, a whole day or half a day, to have enough time on a subject matter, whether it is CFTA, whether it is reform, whether it's very important. That is something that COVID taken away at the level of the assembly, even the level of executive council, but having enough time to reflect on a subject matter is very important. So I'm not going to continue because it has been said, but the reform is bringing a lot in terms of actors, so that RECs really get their rightful position in making decisions, in the process of making decision, but also in making sure that every voice, is on board, and more Africans get to understand what the African Union is doing. I happen to be on a committee that is looking into evaluation of Agenda 2063, and you could see how the civil society, the youth, the women are going to play a role in this, not because but because these are the people, the citizens that Agenda 2063 has to have an impact on. So they need to listen to them. What it is that, do you know Agenda 2063? How did it impact you? How do you want in the second 10-year plan to look like? So those are some of the elements that are very important. I don't want to take much longer. Again, thank you so much, Amani, for inviting me. But it's good to have these perspectives from researchers and academia to the, to practice, to the reality. It's interesting, and I hope such discussions will continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hope Tumukunde, for that, for your contribution, for your insights, particularly speaking from your experience within the PRC, and also for touching upon some of the key issues around the timing of engaging the African Union, not only at the summit level, but also in between the time happening between the summits. And now maybe I would like to give the floor to our final speaker, and after that we'll go into question and answer session. I would like to introduce Faten Agad, who is the Senior Advisor at the African Climate Foundation. Prior to this position, she was the Senior Advisor to the AU High Representative, Dr. Carlos Lopez, on the High Representative on AU-EU relation post-2020. And Faten will, if you kindly take the floor and give us a bit of insight around partnership, but also how that impacts decision-making and policy-making process. You have the floor.
Thank you very much to the Amani team for the invitation. Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to Ambassador Hope, lovely to see you, and to the rest of the panel. What I would like to focus on is more the international dimension of decision-making in the African Union, and really try to zoom into that, and I will conclude with some reflections on the challenges there. First of all, it sometimes seems, and it's a comment that I often hear, that the African Union is this very complex animal that's very difficult to understand when it comes to decision making. And you know, I often remind people on how even difficult and the time required to try and understand how the UN functions. It took me a good 10 years to understand how the European Union functions. And so I think this is the nature of multilateral and intergovernmental organizations. And I think in many ways, some of the observations that I will make about the AU may actually be recognizable, I think, to many who have dealt with the European Union from a country perspective, for instance, or the UN system altogether. I think the other thing that's becoming very clear, and in which we have to contextualize the decision-making process of the African Union with regards to international partnerships, is that the AU is increasingly being recognized as a possible multilateral force. And at times, I think that even as Africans, perhaps we do not recognize that necessarily. But I think the power of an African voice in multilateralism is important, and is seen by many as being important. And so because of that, I think we need to take international decision-making around international relations also in that context, where there are engagements, not just internally, but there are broader considerations, geopolitical considerations that also have an influence on how decisions, or what kind of decisions do we come to. Now, just to go into the, I wanted to categorize, if I can put it that way, the different forms. There's a certain typology, perhaps, of the different kind of international partnerships that the AU, quote unquote, engages into. The first one is, and I think it's there where there's sometimes a lot of emphasis, is the international partnerships, as in those leading up to summits. So partnership summits that often become the face of an international engagement of the African Union. And there's there are multiple actors. I mean, it is a moment that happens every 3 to 5 years. The African Union has partnership summits with different partners. The EU, there's one with the European Union, one with China. There is, and those are AU, what is labeled as with the AU taking the lead as a body, so to speak. Although with many others, even though it's labeled as Africa, but a lot of the discussion also takes place as if it were an AU-EU kind of partnership engagement. And there are multiple actors that are involved. And that includes the summit level, so the heads of states, it includes the Executive Council. But in my opinion, I think a lot of the legwork is actually done at the level of the Permanent Representatives Committee, together with the African Union Commission, and the PRC really works, I think, quite tirelessly in preparation for that. Even at the level of the PRC, we're looking here at two-legged process, if I can call it that way. The first and the bulk of the work being prepared at the level of the Subcommittee for Multilateral Affairs, and that's then elevated for confirmation of decision to the PRC level. There's also, and we shouldn't, before I jump to the next point, I think there's also obviously a role to input by different African Union agencies. So the AU-AUDA, the African Union Development Agency, for instance, has an input, Africa CDC, etc., depending on the thematics that are to be tackled in that particular context. The RECs, although their role is not very as pronounced perhaps as one would like to see, but the RECs are also consulted on some issues. But just to support also some of the points that were made earlier by the other speakers, that there is a need to also think on how do we mainstream the role of the RECs in international partnerships. And I say that because in the case of certain partnerships, the international partner engages with the African Union system at different levels. And when it comes to the RECs, there is a direct engagement with the REC, largely around financing. And there I would truly, I mean, to back the point of Ambassador Hope, that I think how we manage the financing issue of African institutions, including the AU system, can actually help us in bringing a certain level of coherence in the way the AU system altogether engages with international partners. And I think the case of the RECs, where there is perhaps a sense that they engage to secure financing, and then the African Union Commission engages to secure financing, and different parts of the puzzle engage to secure financing, can lead to a situation of lack of consistency, complementarity, etc. There's also the role of the Africa group of ambassadors in capitals of partner countries. If I take the partnership with the EU, for instance, there is an Africa group of ambassadors that is based in Brussels that plays an important role. We have a similar situation in Beijing, etc. So they tend to work quite closely with the subcommittee also to feed into the discussion on the decisions. And of course, there's the African Union Commission in the lead up of these summits that plays an important role. And they're just to reinforce the point of Ambassador Hope, that when it comes to drafting even of communiques, for instance, the Commission holds the pen there. And so there's a certain power of the Commission, but that obviously needs to be done with member states in mind. What comes there needs to take into account also what is acceptable and what's not acceptable for some of the member states. I'll come back to this point later on because I would like to invest a bit time in it. But so we do have the partnership summits, and which are often moments that give a face, so to speak, to international engagements. The Commission, the African Union Commission itself, does have its engagement also with international partners through support to specific programs coordinated by the Commission. And the third level that I wanted to highlight is that international relations is conducted both bilaterally and multilaterally in the African Union system. So individual countries naturally have their bilateral relations with all these international partners with whom the AU also has partnership summits. And there is the multilateral component and that includes, for instance, some of the programs that are managed, the AU programs, be it on agriculture, be it on health, etc. And often the discussion is how to deal with this subsidiarity issue in international partnerships. There's obviously a legitimate sovereign place there for bilateral relations by member states, but at what point then, where does the multilateral component come, preferably in support in a way that speaks also to these country priorities. On that point, perhaps let me jump into some of the challenges, as I would like to keep some time for questions. Maybe picking up on this point of subsidiarity. And how do we ensure a certain complementarity between the multilateral engagement done as an African Union with an international partner, with engagements done bilaterally? And there, what we see sometimes is perhaps what I would say is a missed opportunity to link the two. And let me give one example in an area that I now jumped into, which is the climate change negotiations, where I think we need to think, we often think of climate change negotiations strictly within the context of the UNFCCC, but I think there is a huge opportunity there to leverage multilateral partnerships, for instance, between Africa and the European Union, Africa and China during this summit, to be able to secure certain concessions that we can use then at the level of the UNFCCC negotiations, which can be very difficult. But that is perhaps an area where this link between the bilateral and the regional / multilateral could be strengthened. And one way of doing that is there's often talk of some kind of African Union international engagement strategy with partners. And at the level of the African Union, as part of the follow-up to the AU reforms process, that process of thinking how does an African Union international engagement strategy looks like is underway. But the challenge is how do we do it on a basis of partner specific, for instance, what is expected of the EU would be different from what is expected from China, for instance. But nonetheless, I think thinking about our strategy and our engagement with international partners in a way that considers the bilateral and the multilateral aspect would be interesting. And there, the question is whether it is useful, and that's a bit the missing link at the moment. Is which areas as a union. Does the discussion require a solid consensus on multilateral, a solid consensus on how do we engage multilaterally? And one of them is, for instance, on, as I said, on climate. There's also the trade component. We do have now an AFCFTA. That has a legally binding that's legally binding as a continental tool, but its implementation needs to take also into account our trade engagements internationally. What kind of legally binding trade engagements are we committing to at the level with different international partners? Two more points. I think, as I said, there is power in engaging multilaterally, but the challenge is also how do we strengthen the legal analysis component, and there, just to back also what Ambassador Hope said there, the real need to strengthen for instance, the legal capacity, legal analysis capacity of the African Union Commission. That should be in, one of the most important departments, if I dare to say so. But often, and very practically speaking, sometimes there are legal analysis issues that could come in support of the member state engagements, and where we need to strengthen it. And the other one is the foresight capability, foresight as well as analysis capability, to be able to understand in situations of engagement where an international partner is going with its thinking, not in terms of what it's saying now, but often these negotiations are done with a long-term perspective. And we've seen it, for instance, in different negotiations, that the partner comes to the table not thinking about the situation now, but thinking about where they're going in 10 years and where they want to achieve that. And we need to strengthen our foresight capabilities in that sense, to be able to exercise that same kind of or to support that same kind of engagement. It doesn't have to be at the level perhaps of each country, and it's there perhaps the beauty of a continental arrangement. So how can we pull these the resources, if I can put it that way, to strengthen this foresight? My last point is that one of the weaknesses, I would say, is that despite the strength of African non-state actors on issues related to intra-African questions, so be it we have very rich plethora of actors on justice-related issues, on governance-related issues, on elections, etc. But there is a gap there in terms of international engagement, and how do we connect what we are doing internally? For instance, all the advocacy work around governance, how do we connect that to international relations, and how can that be brought into spaces where in certain situations member states are perhaps open to some of the more practical suggestions on how to move a certain negotiation on a certain issue. And so there, I think there is a perhaps a certain gap, and maybe it's a question of connecting and expanding into this space. But it would certainly be, I think, an enriching experience for Africa's international engagement to tackle some of this link and the role. Look really at the role of civil society, think tanks, etc., in international partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faten, for that contribution, particularly honing on the partnership aspect. Thank you again, once again, for all our panelists. I think now we'll open the floor for question and answer. And from the floor, if there's anyone, yes, I see Soliana, ICRC, and we'll take one round of question and answer.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for a very interesting presentations and intervention. My name is Soliana from ICRC Delegation to the African Union. My question is more directed to Dr. Salamon. So your presentation, or the presentation of the report, captures more of the formal processes and actors of the African Union in terms of the decision-making process. But to what extent have your analysis really delve into the informal processes of decision-making process at the AU? Because, there are really interesting factors, for instance, the stances of member states in decision-making process, domestic priorities, the interest of regional hegemons, for example, and priorities as well. So these all factors into the formal structures and processes. We see it at the Peace and Security Council agenda formulation sometimes, where there are negotiations, trade-offs in those negotiations because of these factors. So to what extent have you considered these in your reports? That would be interesting to. So also on the Peace and Security Council, if I may explain a bit on the agenda process, that we see the Peace and Security Council being challenged by the priorities of member states. And once decisions are out, communiques are out, we see the challenge of really implementing it at the member states level. So I just want you to also link my suggestion, and I would like to hear your reflection on that. Thank you.
Thank you. if there's anyone, or if I would also like to remind our participants on Zoom to send us your comments as well. And if there is any suggestion, comments and questions, please let us know. And if there is no one from the floor, I will let Solomon answer this question. But in the meantime, please let us know if there's any additional.
It would be good also if there are participants online who would like to speak as well, if they can raise their hand and speak. Thank you very much, Soliana. I wish to once again thank Ambassador Hope and Fatan as well. On the factors that shape decision-making process. Okay, so as you can see from the title of what we did, it's mapping of African Union decision-making actors and processes. All right, we haven't, touched on the factors that actually shape decision-making process as a distinct area of analysis. What we did is basically give a nod to the fact that, the point that I made earlier on. We have formal processes, but things do not necessarily unfold in the way they are written down formally. That they happen in the course of negotiations. They take different form and we made reference to also the informal network-based engagements. And as I said, this on its own is a standalone subject of analysis rather than being, something that you put under the decision-making process as such, because these are critical questions, issues that, how do you go about building consensus? Okay, what are the kinds of negotiations that happen? Sometimes you clearly see that it's not really in-house. During the formal deliberations, those things happen. It is particularly when, in the course of politically sensitive subjects, all right? These negotiations do not happen in the formal setting, they happen outside. We, as I said, gave that note to these different factors of questions, for example, how politically salient the agenda is. What is the level of public interest, whether it is within Africa or internationally, on the agenda? What are the consequences of that particular subject matter in terms of money, in terms of affecting the sovereignty of states, in terms of institutionally speaking within the broader African Union system. Depending on all of these factors, and of course we have the whole question of leadership that is extremely critical. All right, so the point I'm making is this on its own needs and deserves standalone analysis. That is why we indicated basically that this is where things are moving forward, including on the basis of case studies. We need to engage further. Okay, how in practice that plays itself out, including the informal dimension of it, and these various forces and factors, how they interact with each other to give you that ultimate final outcome or lack of it.
I think we have another comment coming from the Zoom platform.
Thank you very much. I really wish to appreciate the quality of the panelists, and I think the choice was very diversified. That's why we have really enjoyed listening to them. I have one question to Dr. Solomon, and I would like to make an observation or two. The question I have to Dr. Solomon is, did you try to classify the decisions that were emanating from the outsiders. To give an example, how many decisions the African Union were generated through an interaction with the regional economic community. I will just give an example. I think for quite a good number of years, the African Union really interacted with the regional economic communities, especially when it was time to develop continental frameworks like PIDA for infrastructure, CADEP for agriculture, APSA for peace and security, and the AGA for governance. I'm very interested to know the proportion of the decisions or kind of outcomes of the deliberation of the AU which were generated from that angle. My two observations are the following. First, to say that as Ambassador Hope said it, the interaction with REX, the involvement with REX was really facilitated for the first time with this institutional reform, especially through the introduction of the mid-year coordination summit, even though it is very recent, but more importantly by the establishment of the new protocol on relation between AU and REX. Unfortunately, as actually Ambassador Hope said it, we still need to really conclude this whole issue of the division of labor. Number two, my second observation is, whether we like it or not, I think it will be much clearer for AU to involve regional economic communities if we come up with what I think this last speaker said, the partnership strategy, how the whole African family, AU and REX, interact with partners. And I think if we don't have a clear division of labor, that partnership strategy is not going to come out very clearly. I will stop there, Chairperson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Matata, for that contribution. And maybe if there are any further questions, we will take that. But otherwise, I will give the floor to Solomon since this question was directed to him. But if any of the panelists would also like to reflect, you are also most welcome.
I would like to thank Ambassador Matata for joining us and sharing his very rich insight from his long engagement in the work of the African Union, particularly in the relationship between the AU and regional economic communities. You are absolutely right in terms of the development of continental frameworks. And indeed, one can say that one of the major developments in terms that even enhanced or heightened the need for more coordination, closer working relationship between the AU and REX is the adoption of Agenda 2063, and within the framework of Agenda 2063, the various flagship projects, the initiation of those flagship projects, they, for the first time, one can say, actually brought visibility, if you like, to what the Abuja Treaty envisaged to see happening at the continental level. I think it is those engagements, and of course, I think there are certain other areas where the engagement between REX and the African Union has been, at a higher level or a deeper level. although we continue to face challenge. As you know, the peace and security dimension is one of those areas where, you know, the relationship, as Ambassador Namira mentioned, between REX and the African Union, there is more in-depth frameworks, whether from the MOU to Article 16 of the PSC protocol. Now, the start of the consultative meeting between the PSC and heads of REX decision-making on peace and security. Obviously, one of the challenges, I think, in this respect, Ambassador, as you would agree, is REX do not come in one size. They come in different sizes. For example, some of the recent challenges that we face at African continent with respect to unconstitutional change of government. Some REX have norms which is comparable to the norm of the African Union, which bans unconstitutional changes of government. Other REX do not have it. And that basically puts the engagement around the issue of unconstitutional change of government in a difficulty. I'm just giving, you know, a recent example, but there are many other aspects in terms of their mandates. Some have much more stronger mandate than others in terms of their level of institutional development. Some are advanced, others advanced so much so that, you know, people argue that they are even ahead of the African Union. Others, they are way behind. I think it is these dynamics that I think that would continue to affect smooth, more integrated working relationship between REX and the African Union. I think on others, perhaps it's better if either Ambassador Hope, Thomas, or Faten could also intervene. And Ambassador Namira, please.
Okay, you have the floor, Ambassador. Thank you. Just to add a small comment on what Ambassador Matata said. It's good to hear your voice, and you are absolutely right on the reminder on the role of the REX in the continental frameworks. And I wanted to add here that there is on the partnership strategy, there is a strategy that is being elaborated on partnerships, on AU partnerships, but we need to see and to check if there is that element, you know, of REX, you know, but it is in the advanced stages, and I think it's possible that you can make sure both are reflected, how the AU with its REX, they interact with partners. I think it's very important because some of the partners are the same across the board. So, and also the question of conclusion of division of labor, it's high time, it's very important. There is also a question of rationalization of REX, which has been another slippery slope. But yes, for me, I've taken note of especially conclusion of the division of labor. It's very critical. It's high time. And of course, we'll be all of us checking if the strategy on partnerships reflects both the AU and the REX. I told you we are here discussing, but also contributing to decision somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hope. I think we have Ambassador Namira would also like to take the floor. So I would like if Ambassador Namira can make your contribution as well, please. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. And let me thank Dr. Solomon for this very interesting debate. It's very insightful. As someone who sat in these meetings for more than 4 years within the reform process, I can assure you that this issue of division of labor is very tricky. although it's important, but it needs to be defined properly what is the goal of this division of labor. Because in the meetings with the representatives of REX, in the meetings in relation to the mid-year coordination, you will find a huge diversion of views on what constitutes the division of labor. Here, touching on the issue of partners and to have proper coordination in relation to what we want from partners, you will find a lot of obstruction from others. Because number one, a lot of RECs, as Dr. Solomon said, they differ. Like we have only 8 RECs that are recognized by the African Union as RECs, and they differ in their capacities. Some of them, they expect the AU to do everything for them, especially when it comes to the gaps in funding, which is merely impossible because even within the AU, we still have gaps in funding. So the most important factor to move on with this issue of division of labor is first to have an agreement. What is the content of division of labor that we want to? And in order to make sure that the resources will not be duplicated, especially in programs that will be carried out by the AU and also carried out by the RECs in the same region. This is a crucial element that we have to think about when we speak about the division of labor. One thing in relation to the RECs, because sometimes when we speak about RECs, it looks like we only speak about them when it comes to documents, and we mention it and we have them around rather than have them really in practice. Just want to give a quick example to where we have RECs involved in something that's not even related to peace and security. When we were elaborating on the annexes of the Lomé Charter for the Maritime Charter, the RECs are part and parcel of the strategy task force, the African Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050 task force, which is entrusted to implement and come up with a roadmap to implement the strategy. This task force looked into the annexes of the Lomé Charter to validate them before it goes to the member states. And we had some members from some RECs who were very active, and they were specialists in the field, and they were very useful. So this is a type of engagement that we have directly with members of the RECs in relation to the work. One thing in relation to the decisions, because I think the Amani Africa study is very interesting, but I also want to say that within our limited resources at the Office of the Legal Counsel, when I was a legal counsel, we managed to finish also a study on the issue of decisions and the implementation of decisions of the African Union, which is yet to be validated by our member states. So it's not yet published, but it is finished from our side. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Namira. Perhaps now we can conclude this part of the session after we give concluding contributions from our panelists. Maybe from each of our panelists, if you can give us just one final insights or concluding kind of remarks from your side, and then we can conclude this seminar. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Thomas Tieku to give us his final remarks. Professor Thomas, okay, I don't think he's with us at the moment, so I will perhaps give the floor to Faten. I see some of the comments are addressed in the chat box, but if you have any additional comments that you would like to deliver, please, you have the floor.
No, nothing additional from my end. I just answered the question indeed in the chat. I'm happy to clarify if need be later on. Thank you. Or via email. Happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will give now to Ambassador Hope as well, if you have any final observations or comments.
Just to appreciate you again as Amani and your partners for this initiative, which will go a long way in assisting in more understanding of the process and actors, especially for those, especially partners and non-insider, of course, actors. And I know there is one embassy, I think it's New Zealand, that every year puts together an AU handbook, which is very important, especially for new diplomats coming to Addis. But I think this can also really contribute in a good understanding of the processes, the actors. I had advised them to think of, inductions like every 6 months. This is a good material for induction for new diplomats. Yes, that is a recommendation that really you may wish to think more as you go forward, as you continue to work with the AU. A second is that you might not exhaust really that understanding of the actors and even processes, really, that those that are formal and that others are informal, actors direct and others are indirect, insider and non-insider. But eventually, everything feeds into the one process that leads into the assembly and the executive council and of course the PRC. But it's an ecosystem, which for me, I think it's healthy, very healthy, so that by the time a decision is taken, it has been benefited from, experts and practitioners and people who understand the subject. So for me, I think this is very good. And as we continue to implement the AU institutional reform, these are some of the things that will be emphasized and streamlined and having the proper, actors in their proper position, like the RECs. I know a division of labor will be finalized eventually, and also to make sure that everything fits into place, what the AU can stay doing, what the RECs can do, and in a harmonized way. It's a matter of time, and then also national levels. So again, thank you so much for having me here. I learned and I noted a lot. It was so insightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again for our panelists, for our speakers who have joined us and who have also joined us here today and joining us on Zoom. Maybe from our side, from my side, personally, I would like to say thank you for the rich deliberations, for the insights, and for the discussions from the various perspectives from our speakers, but also from the contribution from our participants. On behalf of Amani, I would like to say thank you, and I would like to give the floor to Solomon as well to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Bitania, for excellent moderation of this panel. I would like also to once again recognize with appreciation Ambassador Hope for making time and being with us. I know that it's not easy in a time of Zoom with many meetings organized at the same time. I'm really grateful, Amani Africa. I also wish to thank Faten for making time and sharing with us your very rich insights, particularly on an aspect of the engagement of the African Union involving partners. Ambassador Namira, your hands-on knowledge and engagement in the AU processes shed light on many aspects of your interventions, which we wouldn't have been able to capture otherwise. So we are extremely grateful for that. We also wish you very well in your new assignment. You have more success than you already had while you were legal counsel. I also wish to thank Professor Thomas for for joining us. I don't know what time it is in Canada now, but I think we are really grateful for that. For us, Adamani, I think, as we said, this is really an important tool for facilitating knowledge on the African Union, because one of the things that we would like to do is really knowledge production on the African Union, engage in knowledge production on the African Union, and in making the African Union as intelligible, as understandable as it can be. And through that process, people's perceptions and understanding, but also they would be able to plan well to engage much more meaningfully the African Union in its wider process and contribute to the objectives and ideals of the African Union. It helps also in connecting, scholarship, policy research thinking with practice. I think that connecting role and contribution is extremely valuable that we take into account. Hope said, basically, the possibility also of the induction that she mentioned, which is also extremely useful. Of course, we would like to request Ambassador Hope to join us for that as well. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. I wish you a very good evening, a very good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you once again.